At an altitude above 26,000 feet, the human body starts to die, and this area is referred to as the death zone. The oxygen is 1/3 than that at sea level, and anyone attempting to climb peaks of high altitudes has to spend weeks acclimatizing to get a higher concentration of red blood cells in their body. Climbers typically use supplemental oxygen in the death zone, but it's a race against time because as soon as they enter, they are slowly dying. Their brains and lungs are starved for oxygen, and there's an increased chance of heart attack and stroke, and judgment quickly becomes impaired. And movement is more laborious, and their strength is greatly diminished. Everyone experiences these effects to different degrees, but this does happen to everyone in the death zone. Add on top of that the extreme cold, and any mistake, any bad choice could quickly lead to death. And in the death zone, if you are unable to move yourself down to a lower altitude, no one can really help you. And if they do, it's at a great risk to their life. This is part 2 of my coverage of the 1996 Adventure Consultants Expedition to Mount Everest. Last video I talked about back weathers, and today I'll be talking about Rob Hall, the leader of an expedition caught in a storm that claimed 8 lives on Everest. This is SOSAD, Stories of Survival and Death, a series where I talk about people in horrific situations, their lives, and how they either survived or died in that situation. So if that interests you, please like and subscribe, and let's get into today's video. Robert Edwin Hall was born January 14th, 1961 in Christchurch, New Zealand. He was the youngest of 9 children in a working-class Roman Catholic family. Though he had a quick scientific mind, he dropped out of school at the age of 15 after experiences with a tyrannical teacher. He got a job at Alps Sports, which manufactured climbing equipment, and because he was organized and very efficient, he was soon running the production side of the company. Rob was an avid hill walker, and soon after starting his job at Alps Sports, he picked up rock and ice climbing as well. He was a quick learner, and he would watch other climbers, and he was able to mimic their movements and pick up their skills quite rapidly. In 1980, when Rob was 19, he joined an expedition to climb Ama de Blanc, which is about 15 miles south of Everest. And while he was there, he visited the base camp of Everest, and he decided that he wanted to climb it one day. He became a professional climber, and he would seek out sponsorships to help pay for his Himalayan expeditions because it was quite expensive. And he realized that the more media attention he got, the easier it was to get these sponsorships. And he had a flair for publicity, so he found it very easy to get his name and his face in the media. In 1988, a man named Gary Ball became Rob's climbing partner and closest friend. After 10 years of training and 2 failed attempts, Rob finally summited Mount Everest in May 1990. He was the leader of an excursion that included Gary and Peter Hillary, son of Sir Edmund Hillary, who was the first confirmed person to summit Mount Everest, and he's the namesake of the Hillary Step. On the way up to Everest in 1990, Rob met Jan Arnold. She was a mountaineering enthusiast and a physician from New Zealand who ran the clinic closest to Mount Everest. And when he got back down from the mountain, he asked her out. His idea for their first date was to go to Alaska and climb Mount McKinley, and she agreed. and they got married 2 years later in 1992. And right after they summited Mount Everest, Rob and Gary decided that they wanted to do the 7 summits in 7 months. And Richard Bass, who had pioneered that challenge, that achievement, it took him 4 years to do it. They got funding from an electrical company called Powerbuild, and on December 12th, 1990, just hours before their time limit was set to expire, they summited the Vinson Massif and completed their 7 summits in 7 months goal. Rob and Gary also orchestrated a cleanup of Mount Everest Base Camp in 1990, which removed 5 tons of garbage left by climbers over the previous years. And they worked with the Kathmandu government to ensure that future climbers would be responsible for their trash by imposing a $4,000 deposit that would be refunded when the climbers brought back a predetermined amount of garbage. After they completed their challenge, Rob and Gary were worried about how they'd continue to get sponsorships because climbers would have to continue doing bigger and bolder things in order to get these sponsorships. And they felt like if they continued doing this at this level, that they would likely die doing it. It was a great risk. So they decided to go a different direction to fund their expeditions, and they got into high altitude guiding, and they kind of pioneered this, and it started the commercialization of mountain climbing, high altitude mountain climbing. They didn't get to choose their climbs, and they had to attend to their clients instead of just enjoying the climb. But this was more sustaining than seeking out sponsorships. So they started Holland Ball Adventure Consultants with the draw of guiding clients up the 7 summits. And it did well. In May 1992, they led 6 clients up to the summit of Mount Everest and 7 the following year. Jan accompanied as the doctor in 93, and she summited with Rob that year. And then in 94 and 95, she stayed at base camp as the team doctor. Rob received some backlash for his company though. Sir Edmund Hillary decried Rob and Adventure Consultants for the commercialization of Everest, and he felt that people who guided novices up for a fee were disrespecting the mountain. Sir Edmund Hillary is one of the most honored people in New Zealand. He's on their $5 note, and so this was very upsetting and embarrassing for Rob, especially coming from somebody that he idolized. This was one of his childhood heroes. Rob wanted to defend himself, but he realized that going up against such a highly regarded person was a no-win situation, so he remained quiet. And then in October of 1993, Gary died of HACE, or high altitude cerebral edema, which is swelling of the brain caused by high altitude. He died during a summit attempt of Dhaulagiri, and he died in Rob's arms, and Rob buried him in a crevasse. Rob was devastated by the loss of his closest friend, but he dealt with it quietly, and he decided that he would continue their business alone. By 1995, Rob had led 39 people to the summit of Mount Everest and rightly touted Adventure Consultants as the world leader of Everest climbing with more ascents than any other organization. In 1996, Rob charged more than any other company at $65,000 a person. But with his huge success rate, he didn't really have a hard time finding clients to fill his roster for the year. And Jan was pregnant, so she didn't attend as the team doctor as she had in previous years. She stayed home instead. On March 31st, 1996, the expedition members gathered in Kathmandu, and then they flew from Kathmandu to Lukla via helicopter. And then they took about a week trekking and acclimatizing to Everest Base Camp. The team consisted of Rob, his fellow guides Andy Harris and Mike Groom, Helen Wilton, the base camp manager, Carolyn McKenzie, the doctor, and clients John Taskey, Stuart Hutchison, Beck Weathers, Lou Kosicki, Doug Hansen, John Krakauer, Frank Fishbeck, and Yasuko Namba. On April 7th, a day before they were set to arrive at base camp, a Sherpa named Tenzing, who was employed by Rob, was seriously injured while trying to establish a route for the expedition up the lower parts of Everest just above Camp 1. He had fallen 150 feet into a crevasse. 4 Sherpas were able to get him out of the crevasse, but a helicopter rescue at that altitude was deemed unreasonable, and so he had to be lowered 3,000 vertical feet back down to base camp. Rob had a huge respect and love for the Sherpas. He impressed the importance for his clients to continually thank and respect them, and would remind them that without their help, they would have no chance of getting to the summit. It took all day and a group of 35 Sherpas, but they were able to get Tenzing back to base camp and life-flighted to a hospital in Kathmandu. When the Sherpa was safe, Rob gave the go-ahead for the rest of the expedition to get to base camp. And there were 14 different expeditions and over 300 tents. Rob was highly respected and well-liked by everyone at the camp. And he was not only known for his expertise, but his commanding presence. He wasn't afraid to be the bad guy if he needed to, and he served as kind of the unofficial leader of everyone at base camp. He settled disputes, took care of medical issues, and gave advice to other guides, some of which were his competition for clients. None more than Scott Fisher, the leader of the Mountain Madness expedition. Scott had been the one to get John Krakauer, the author of Into the Wild and In With Outside magazine, to fund his expedition to Everest, but Rob had landed the deal. However, Scott had put this behind him and he held no ill will towards Rob, and he still would go to him for advice almost more than any of the other guides. They had this sort of friendship and camaraderie. Guides have to time their arrival to Camp 4 for their summit push just right. They have to be on oxygen pretty much the entire time they are at Camp 4 and above. If there's too much crowding, there won't be enough time to get to the summit, so expeditions have to coordinate the date for their summit bid, and Adventure Consultants, Mountain Madness, and a South African team had their bid for May 10th. So on May 6th, they headed up from base camp for their summit push because it takes several days for them to climb the mountain. Rob and the other teams were frustrated when the Taiwanese expedition ignored agreements and ascended with them, but this was more of an annoyance than it was a concern at the time. They got up to Camp 4 on the evening of May 9th, and it was windy and cold, and so they quickly set up their tents and rested, hoping that the weather would calm so that they would be able to reach the summit, because if the window of opportunity didn't open up within a certain amount of time, then they would have to descend and give up their climb. When the South African team arrived, they weren't doing well. They were just so exhausted, and so they decided to give up their attempt. At around 10 p.m., the wind died down and the window opened, and so Rob informed the team that they would be leaving around 11:30 p.m. He impressed the importance of them listening to him completely, not arguing with him, just whatever he said was law. And he said they had a turnaround time of 1 or 2 p.m. at the latest. He wanted to have the group stay close together for the first half of the climb, and so the faster climbers would sometimes find themselves sitting and waiting for almost up to an hour for the rest of the group to catch up. The Mountain Madness and Taiwanese expeditions also started around this time as well, and so with 33 climbers on the mountain, it slowed the progression quite a bit. And Rob stayed at the back of the team in order to assist with the ones that were struggling, and the other guides and Sherpas kind of led the way. After about 3 hours, Frank Fishbeck turned back saying that he felt that there was something off about the day. And soon after, Doug Hansen stepped out of line saying that he wasn't feeling very well and he was planning to descend. But after a quick conversation with Rob, he got back in line and continued ascending. Doug had made an attempt the previous year with Adventure Consultants, and Rob had turned him around 330 feet from the top, and it was something that ate at him every day since then. And Rob felt for him, and so he invited Doug back for this attempt at a highly reduced rate. Around 7:30, Beckweather's eyesight gave out due to the altitude affecting a recent surgery, and Rob offered to have 2 Sherpas take him back to camp, but Beck didn't want to give up the climb, and he felt that his eyesight would get better. So Rob told Beck that if his eyesight didn't improve within a half hour, that he needed to stay right there and wait for Rob to get back from the summit so that he could make sure that Beck got back to camp okay. At 11:30, Luke Kosichke, John Taskey, and Stuart Hutchison turned around because it was still about 3 hours to get to the summit, and the progression had been going so slow that they knew they wouldn't get there before the turnaround time. This seemed to weigh on Rob. He was disheartened that 5 of his clients had already turned around. Not only was this bad for his business and reputation, but he was genuinely sad for them as well. They had worked hard towards this goal and they wouldn't be achieving it this season. But there were other issues on the mountain. Due to some confusion about securing ropes, the Sherpas had not gone ahead of the expeditions to secure them. And so when they got to the Hillary step, there were no fresh lines. So a bottleneck was created near the Hillary step as the guides lay the lines. This put them behind by about an hour, and only 6 people had reached the summit before the turnaround time. Rob reached the summit around 2:30 after 2 of his 3 remaining clients, John Krakauer and Yasuko Namba, had summited and were on their way back down. And he made a radio call down to base camp to celebrate, and he let them know that he would head back down as soon as Doug Hansen, who was just over the ridge, got there. And if they didn't hear from him again, that meant everything was going well. Scott had been feeling ill, and so he hadn't left Camp 4 until around 1 o'clock in the morning. And so he wasn't there to help with any of the issues that arose on the mountain. And he didn't reach the summit until around 3:30 when all of his team had already started their descent. And they offered to take him back to camp with them, but he wanted to get to the summit, so he declined. Scott would have encountered Rob near the summit along with members of the Taiwanese expedition long after the turnaround time, but The weather wasn't too bad, and so it wasn't that worrisome of a delay, but it was still something that they were concerned about. I think that with all the issues they encountered that day, Rob had decided to forgo his turnaround time in order to get clients to the summit. And so Rob was still at the summit waiting for Doug when Scott left soon after he had arrived. But Rob was getting even more weary of the time, and so he sent the two Sherpas that were with him, Ing Dorji and Norbu, down. He had them descend, and when Doug came into view, he assisted him to the summit, and Doug was having a really hard time, but Rob got him there. It was the last 30, 40 feet, and they celebrated for a couple minutes, and then Rob quickly had them turn around and head down. Doug reached the summit at 4 p.m., and at 4:15 p.m., Rob got on the radio asking for help, asking for someone to bring up some oxygen because Doug had become incapacitated. Doug had given everything he had to get to the summit, leaving him with no energy or willpower for the descent. Andy Harris was at the oxygen stash on the South Summit, and he radioed back to Rob that there was no oxygen at the South Summit, that all the bottles there were empty. And Andy was in a very hypoxic state. Hours earlier, he had told other members that the oxygen bottles were empty, but when they attached them to the rig, which was the only way that you could see if an oxygen bottle was empty or full or what the level was at, the other expedition members saw that there were at least 6 full canisters there, but Andy could not be convinced that there were full bottles. He believed they were all empty. And it's believed that his regulator was malfunctioning and it wasn't reading the full bottles as full, it was reading them as empty. And so with his inability to really process what was going on, he just believed that they were empty. Mike Groom tried to radio that there were full bottles of oxygen on the South Summit, but his radio was also malfunctioning, and whenever his transmissions did go through, Andy would interrupt to say that there weren't any. And so Rob was confused about whether there were full bottles of oxygen on the South Summit or not, and so he just kept pushing Doug forward, just trying to get him to move. But Rob couldn't get Doug down past this 40-foot vertical drop at the Hillary step, and he could get himself down, but not with Doug. And Guy Cotter, who had worked for Rob on previous expedition, he was at Pamori around 6 miles away leading an expedition there, and he had been listening to the radio transmissions all day. So he got on the radio and he tried to get Rob to leave Doug to go to the South Summit to get more oxygen, but Rob refused to leave Doug. Around 5 p.m., Mike finally got through that there was oxygen on the South Summit, and Lopsang, who was the Sirdar, or the lead Sherpa on the Mountain Madness team, he was on his descent, and Andy asked him if he could help him take these oxygen bottles back up to Rob and Doug, but Lopsang was really concentrating on getting to Scott because Scott was having a really difficult time and he was very loyal to Scott. So Lopsang indicated that he was on his way to Scott and couldn't help. So Andy was last seen working his way to the summit with the 2 oxygen bottles. At 5:30 p.m., Rob was still at the top of the Hillary step with Doug, and Guy tried again to get him to leave Doug, but this annoyed Rob and he refused, implying that Doug could hear that implication. Around 6 p.m., a blizzard suddenly struck Everest, and the wind speeds were around 80 miles per hour, and the temperature dropped with a wind chill of -100 degrees Fahrenheit. No one heard from Rob again until 2:46 in the morning, long after the storm had hit, and he probably unknowingly hit the transmit button, and he could be heard yelling, "Keep moving, keep going," and he was probably talking to Doug or Andy or both. And at 4:43 a.m., Rob radioed again from the South Summit, this time asking for help for himself. He said his legs were no longer working and he was too clumsy to keep going. Even though Rob had reached the oxygen stash, the valves on his mask had iced over and he was having a hard time de-icing them. And Rob kept asking about Andy and if he had made it down. He said that Andy had been with him throughout the night, but that he was gone now. At 5 a.m., Rob was patched through to Jan, who was in Christchurch, New Zealand, and Helen Wilton, the base camp manager, would hold the radio up to the satellite phone and alternate between the speakers and receivers. Jan said that he was slurring his words and sounded distant and confused, but she just kept urging him to just keep moving down the mountain. At 5:30 a.m., Rob took a dose of oral dexamethasone, which is a drug that can temporarily aid with the symptoms of altitude sickness, and he said he was still working on de-icing his rig. And he also repeatedly asked about the people who had gone missing in the storm: Makalugau, Scott Fisher, Beck Weathers, Yasuko Namba, and the other members of his expedition. But he seemed the most concerned about Andy. When asked about how Doug was doing, all Rob said was, "Doug, he's gone." And he didn't say anything else, and he never mentioned him again. At 6 a.m., Rob was shaking uncontrollably from the cold, and Guy asked if the sun had reached him yet, and Rob said that it almost had, and he kept asking about Andy. And at 8:43 a.m., he said, "Some of his gear is still here. I thought he must have gone ahead in the nighttime. Listen, can you account for him or not?" They had been dodging this question all night because they didn't want Rob to worry about anyone. They just wanted him to concentrate on getting himself down. But he was persistent, saying that his ice axe and his jacket and things were still there with him. And these are things that no one would leave behind. And they told Rob to use Andy's jacket and to worry about himself and getting down. At 9 a.m., Rob had finally got his mask working again, and so he was able to breathe supplemental oxygen for the first time in about 16 hours. And Helen tried to get him to concentrate on Jan, who was 7 months pregnant, and really encouraged him to get down so that he could meet his daughter. Ing Dorji and Lapka Cherry left Camp 4 around 9:30 a.m. with some hot tea and 2 canisters of oxygen, trying to get to Rob. At this time, the sky was sunny and clear, but the wind was still blowing at around 45 miles per hour, and it was still far below zero in temperature, and so it was a very risky thing that they were attempting to do. And even if they did get to Rob, it would be well past nightfall before they were able to get back. But they were so loyal to Rob that they were willing to risk their lives for a chance to save him. Everyone tried to convince Rob to move down to a lower altitude to meet them, and Rob told them several times that he was getting ready to go, but he never did actually leave. At 3 p.m., Ing and Lapka were still 700 vertical feet down from the South Summit, and the storm started picking up again, and so they had to turn back around and return to camp. At 3:20 p.m., Guy came from the base camp of Pomori to the base camp of Everest, and he got on the radio and scolded Rob and really tried to get him to move. And Rob yelled back that if he thought he could have gone down himself, he would have 6 hours earlier, and to just send a couple people up with something hot to drink and that he'd be fine. And Guy let him know that the rescue attempt had to be abandoned and that he needed to move lower. So Rob said he thought he could last another night there and to just send them back up in the morning. And Guy said that they would. At 6:20 p.m., they called Rob to let him know that Jan was on the satellite phone waiting to be patched through. And Rob asked for a minute. He said his throat was dry and that he wanted to eat some snow to clear his throat. And then a couple minutes later, Rob got on the line and they exchanged greetings. Jan asked if he was comfortable and how his feet were. Rob said that given the circumstances, he was okay and that he thought his feet were frostbitten. And Jan said that she was looking forward to taking care of him when he got home after being rescued and to not feel like he was alone. And they went on to talk about some other things, and they decided on naming their daughter Sarah. Rob ended the conversation with, "I love you. Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much." He unknowingly left the radio on after that, though, and anyone listening in could hear him quietly sobbing. And those were the last words anyone heard Rob speak. Any attempt to reach him throughout that night or all throughout the next day went unanswered, and so the rescue attempt was canceled. Even if he was still alive when they got to him, he was at a point where they just couldn't save him. And they also had several other people that were in need of rescue, so they just didn't have the manpower for that either. 12 days later, when David Breashears and the IMAX expedition made their summit attempt, they found Rob's body at the South Summit. He was laying on his right side in a shallow ice hollow with his upper body covered in a thin layer of snow. There's a picture of Rob's body, and I know in my last video I included pictures of bodies on Everest, but I was conflicted on whether I should do that or not, and for this video I didn't feel that it was appropriate. So you can look that up if you want, but I won't be showing it here. But like anyone who dies in the death zone far from camp, Rob's body remains there today. Doug and Andy were never found. There was an ice axe that was found just below the Hillary step that's believed to be Doug's. So the theory is that Rob was able to get him down past the Hillary step, but as soon as the ropes ended, he lost his footing and Doug fell to his death. The only trace of Andy was an ice axe that was confirmed to be his, and it was found near Rob. So this indicates that he was with Rob and had not descended to camp and disappeared in the storm as it was initially thought. John Krakauer, in his hypoxic state, had confused another climber that had descended with him as Andy, and so this is what led to that confusion. So due to Rob's radio transmission accounts, it's theorized that Andy got up sometime during the night as he rested in the ice hollow with Rob, stripped off his jacket in his hyperthermic and hypoxic state, and just walked off, leaving his gear, and he either fell to his death or collapsed somewhere out of view. Jan cherishes that last conversation she had with Rob, them both knowing what was coming, but pretending it was going to be okay. She felt like they were holding hands through the airwaves. She said that there was nothing left unspoken and nothing that she regrets saying. 2 months after the disaster, Jan gave birth to their daughter, Sarah, and she found it hard to find time to grieve. She felt responsible to the families of the other expedition members, and she had been the one to inform Andy Harris's longtime girlfriend, Fiona McPherson, that Andy was not safe back at camp, but that he was missing and presumed dead. Jan was also thrust into the public eye. Strangers were giving their condolences, and within 3 months, Hollywood was calling for production rights. So she tried to keep busy, and she found her work as a doctor therapeutic. Guy Cotter bought Adventure Consultants, and he is now the CEO of the company. Jan remarried in 2002 to Andreas Niemann and had another daughter, Helena, later that year. And Sarah grew up knowing all about her father. Jan would include him in their everyday activities, saying things like, "Oh, chocolate ice cream was your dad's favorite." Sarah also grew a love for mountain climbing. At age 6, she visited the Everest base camp, and she said she wanted to climb it one day. And then at the age of 15, she summited Mount Kilimanjaro. And Jan has said that she has never encouraged or discouraged this. She said Sarah's a lot like Rob, especially with her approach to life and people. As Sarah got older, though, her interests changed and her passion directed elsewhere. She is now 25 and works as a high-performance coach, and she seems to be a very motivated and inspirational person with a passion for helping people achieve their dreams, just like Rob. There are several films, documentaries, and books about the storm that claimed 8 lives. In 1997, 3 works were made. John Krakauer published the book Into Thin Air, a personal account of the Mount Everest disaster. A made-for-TV movie called Into Thin Air, Death on Everest, based on John Krakauer's book. And Anatoly Bukharev's book titled The Climb, which was in part a response to Krakauer's book. In 1998, there was the IMAX documentary Everest. It was directed by David Breashears, who was at Everest during the storm and was a huge part of the rescue efforts. In 2000, Beck Weathers published his book, Left for Dead, My Journey Home from Everest. A documentary, The Dark Side of Everest, was released in 2003, which covered this storm and other events on Everest. In 2003, there was another documentary directed by David Breashears called Remnants of Everest, the 1996 tragedy, also known in the States as Storm over Everest. In 2012, there was an episode of Seconds from Disaster titled Into the Death Zone. In 2015, Joby Talbot's opera Everest premiered. And in 2015, a movie called Everest, which starred Jason Clarke as Rob's character. John Krakauer and Scott's wife, Jeannie Price, have condemned the movie, but Jan has said that Keira Knightley and Jason Clarke's portrayal of their last conversation was very accurate. There's so much more to this story and the people involved than what I've covered. So if you haven't already, I recommend reading John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air, because I think he did a really good job of telling the entirety of what happened. I've heard the story before, but when I really looked into the people more than the event, it just made it so much more devastating. And I think sometimes when stuff like this happens, we get apathetic and we see the casualties as a number rather than people. Rob was someone who believed Everest was for everyone, and he wanted to help people achieve their dream of reaching the top. He respected and loved the people who worked for him, and he cared deeply for his clients. And wouldn't abandon anyone in order to save himself. He survived the night at 28,700 feet with no oxygen, and even when he couldn't move himself, he still worried about other people. Everyone else who's died there has a story. Scott Fisher has a story. Yasuko Namba has a story. There are over 300 stories. Cold, exhaustion, altitude, or a fall claiming their lives. The bodies of Everest are more than just frozen remains. So that's all I have for today's video. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.